Hello, my little earthlings. So in today's video, we are going to be talking about some tips for long tails. This is how to rework a plot when you've already started posting your story or webcomic. Now, this also works if you haven't and you just in general haven't sat down and looked at your story in a long time. But for those who are there freaking out because their long-winded Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter style story has already been posted out to the world and they have some major plot areas that they want to rework, this is going to be my tips for you. So tip number one, has it been a long time since you've actually sat down and looked at all of your major key plot points? Do you keep this somewhere on perhaps a physical board or an online source? It would probably be a good idea to take a full day or an evening off and mentally prepare to sit down and give that entire thing a look over. So I recommend, really just mentally preparing yourself not to add in all of the new crazy notes and things that you want to add in, but to just look at what you already have and sort of just give it a review. This is also really good for my next point, which is to check for any straggler plot points that need to be tied up. And what I mean by this is we're talking anything that you've already said in the story thus far that perhaps you forgot about that was a plot, even if it's a minor one. This way you can make sure that those things get tied up before you move forward. So another thing too is if you don't have all of your major plot points written out and you're keeping a lot of this in your head, or you have it kind of spread out over many different sources, whether that's physical and traditional sources like books and then online notes and resources, I recommend buying a large poster board, one of those ones that folds up, and then go ahead and you can tape all of your major plot points, like the outlines of your plot points, onto that, or get a cork board so you can actually rearrange them and pin them in different places. Or if you're more tech savvy and you like doing everything mainly online, especially if you know you're going to rework your plot often, then I recommend using something called Milanote. This was recommended to me by a friend. Now, the only issue with Milanote is it does have a limited amount of boards and notes unless you pay for the service or you refer a friend. So they do give you quite a lot to start with. So I still recommend checking it out, or I'll put a link to it down below so you guys can check it out. So the next one is going to be check for any continuity errors in clothing, names, ways of speaking, environment designs, or items specifically designed for your world. So this note is also really useful if you are coming out of a hiatus and you haven't touched upon your story in a while. This is less risky when you're just doing something like reworking your plotline while you're still actively working on this, because you're going to be more in the headspace of the story, so the likelihood of missing a continuity error is going to be less. So this actually is probably more of a tip for if you're coming out of hiatus. But in general, always check for those continuity errors, and the best way by doing that is going to be probably giving your story what you have posted so far, just giving it a look over. So sort of reading everything you have actually posted to the world so far, and make sure that you're keeping notes. The next part would be to make a note and go back and rework any draft scripts already written for your plot to incorporate your new ideas. So just even if you don't want to do it that night while you're reworking the plot line, while you're adding in your new plot points, you want to at least make a mental note, or I would probably recommend an actual note to rework those draft scripts when you get to them. And because this is probably a very long, this is tips for a long-winded story, understand that a lot of this, you can't really knock it out all in one go. And what I actually recommend is only reworking whatever draft script you have written if it's coming up next. So, for example, if you have written a draft script that is not until say midway through your story, or perhaps towards the end, and you are still only at the beginning of your tale, you don't actually have to worry about those scripts yet. And it would actually probably be a waste of time if you went and reworked all of your draft scripts that you'd written, especially if you'd written one that's closer towards the end of your story. I wouldn't even touch it until you're within a month or two of publishing that. So what I recommend is anything that's coming up that you know you're going to be actively working on, that's a script that you'll be touching on within the next month or two that you'll be publishing, those are the scripts you want to rework. So the next tip would be gather all of the notes on the plot changes you want to add and either print them out or use an online platform to fit those notes in. So like I said before, yeah, you can add in those new plot points on Milanote, or you can print them out and then add them onto your corkboard or your poster board. And these are probably things that, you have written just in the notes section of your phone when you got the idea or something like that. You wrote it down on a scrap piece of paper and it's floating around somewhere. All of these things, you want to kind of gather them up and kind of just lay them next to your board and then see how you can fit them in. Kind of like take a step back, like a bird's eye view, and just look at the whole board and see where it would fit in well. And if you can't see where it would fit in well, what I notice helps is just pulling off the plot points that you know are needing to be adjusted or moved, and then you might see where to fit it in. So the next tip would be look at the plot point summaries only when you are doing this. Most likely a lot of the details of your plot point will need to be shifted and changed, so don't focus on that. So like, for example, on my plot point board, I have the header of the plot point written in bold, and then down below I have a brief summary of what's supposed to happen in that plot point so I remember. Some of them I have written out a lot more in detail, some of them are a lot shorter. And the thing was that I noticed was I got really caught up in the details of reading what was going on in the summary, especially the longer ones, and then it would kind of stop me from thinking I could shift it around. But since a lot of those dynamics of the plot point are changeable and all that matters is the overall plot, so that's why we say look at the summary, just try not to get tied up in that detail. So yeah, just look at the summary title, rearrange plot points based off of that. The next part would be don't be afraid to arrange and rearrange these plot points as much as necessary until you feel it's right. So that can mean possibly pulling all of your plot points off of the board all the way up till the end of the story. Everything you haven't published so far, you can pull it all off the board and you can start from scratch if you want in terms of rearranging if you feel necessary. Or it might just mean something as simple as pulling one plot point off and switching it out with another. The next part would be willing to scrap or modify anything that doesn't suit the story anymore. So yeah, this is really important as well. This is the concept of making sure that you can sort of flow with the fact that your story is a dynamic living thing. And don't be afraid to go in there and modify things and possibly totally scrap some things. You might look at that plot point board and be like, oh, yeah, this plot isn't even necessary anymore. I don't know why I put this in here. And you can just totally scrap it. I know that it can be easy to get attached to it and be like, oh, well, but like I've been dreaming of using this one plot line for like, I don't know, years. Like, especially if you're working on a long-winded story, you might have been holding on to this cool idea for a long time. And if you feel it's absolutely essential to the story that it needs to happen, then by all means, don't scrap it. Find a way to fit it in. But if you can tell that you're just kind of making excuses to keep that part in, and you know overall it doesn't really suit the story, the cool thing is you can separate that little plot point out, and then you can actually tell the story like that plot point later as something like a spin-off or like a one-off. You can do it as like a bonus story or something that you include in the end of like your published comic or something. You can always come back and grab it later. You don't have to throw it off the board and throw it in the trash can and delete it from your mind. But if it doesn't suit your overall art, like your overarching story, like it doesn't contribute to that, what you're trying to tell right then and there, and it's just like filler almost, just feel free to cut the fat so you can make sure that your story is as where you want it to be. The next part is accept that long stories will take many years to possibly tell, and that also means the story will change and bend as you learn and grow and experience new things. We're often told to write what we know, so naturally stories are going to grow and change because what we know is always expanding. And this is actually really, really great because what it means is that your story actually can get better. If we tie ourselves to thinking we need to tell a story from beginning to end exactly the way in which we originally thought about it, the concept can become outdated. And the concept can also become rigid, and perhaps the original meaning or the drive you had held to wanting to tell it will kind of be lost. It'll lose its authenticity and it might even fall flat. So a good example of this would be, I'd written this one story called Last Light. I had written it back in high school when I was 16. I felt the need to get this story out. I stayed up till 4 in the morning, like every night, practically working on this story. I just felt like crazy obsessed with just wanting to get this story out of my head. And I ended up writing 200 pages of this story in the course of a few months. And even though I knocked the story out real quick, it took me like 10 years to look back and reread it and realize it was not good at all. And it wasn't good because I had knocked the story out really fast. Within a time period in which my perspective was limited. I was only 16 years old. I didn't have enough life experience under my belt to really be able to write the story in the way that I wanted to. Like, I knew the story could be so much more, but my lack of experience with life made the story fail to hold authenticity that I craved for it to have. The story overall, like, it lacked some kind of purpose or message or meaning that only 10 years later, when I decided to actually give the story another shot and rework it into a webcomic, and it's one I'm actually working on right now, I've actually completely redeveloped the plot line. I switched who the main character was. So the characters are both still in there, but I switched the narrating voice basically to a more interesting character. I changed the way that the story ends completely. And on top of it, I took out the heavy back-touching scene because, to be honest, as much as I thought that was the most romantic thing possible, was to have two people, engaging in some heavy back-touching while they're kissing, there's a lot more I have learned since then in relationships that can be more interesting and romantic. So that's a good example of that story actually got better with time. Sort of like wine, it aged better in terms of like when I was willing to give it a fresh look and rework it. It didn't age so well if I left it just the way it is and decided I was going to publish it the way it is. If anything, it's just funny to look back on now. But yeah, that's a good example of don't let the fact that your story's telling a long time to take slow you down or stop you from the fact that, to tell it. Because in fact, if anything, time's just going to make the story even better. So another thing to note is if the process was long overdue, and you haven't reworked this plot in maybe years, or in, say, like it's been like all year and you haven't done it, and it's very overwhelming now because you're deciding you want to do it now. Just make a mental note to go ahead and, like, from this point forward, revise your plot, I would say maybe every 6 months. So kind of give it a fresh look and see if there's anything new that you want to add in. That way the story doesn't run away from you, in a sense. Like, it doesn't get out of your control and you feel like there's too much that would have to be changed, that it's all tangled up. So yeah, if you do that, then this becomes more or less maintenance on the story that you know is going to take a long time. Now, if your story is shorter and you know that it'll take a long time to finish, but it's not going to take like years upon years, then maybe you revise it every month or so. Give it a fresh look over every month. In the end, just remember you are the creator of this world, and there's nothing you can't explain away or decide to add in or take out that you can't just make a reason for in your story, because you're the author of this world. And good authors and good storytellers are able to do it in a way that doesn't seem too coincidental. That is true. But Also understand that if it's just a matter of needing to explain it away so you can move forward in the plot, you do whatever you got to do that's necessary so you can tell your story. And just have fun with it. Just make sure you're having fun with the whole process. Plotline reworks can be really daunting, and sometimes you might know like it's looming over you that you have to do it. But just really wait until you've got that day where you've mentally prepared for it, and that you want to, that you feel ready to. And it's one of those things that naturally will come around, and you will feel that you are ready to. You'll feel when the moment is right. So don't beat yourself up too much if you know that you're sitting on this plot rework and it just seems big and overwhelming and tangled and you haven't done it yet. You've always got time. The great thing about, even if you're actively publishing and working on your comic, the great thing about the pacing of a lot of these things is that you can really buy yourself the time to rework the plots. So yeah, so try to look at it that way. And just have fun with it, guys. I hope some of these tips helped you guys for your stories, and I will see you guys in the next video.